welcome to the Acid Trash Jamboree, and to the beginnings of yet another mini-series, this time dedicated to artists who are or were predominantly active in the field of electronic music. And yeah, to kick off, I'll be taking a look at a bunch of vintage 1970s releases, brought together simply for the fact that I've been listening to them lately and I wanted to say a few words about them. So we start with the one and only solo album from Patrick Vian, as usual the title of which I refuse to butcher with my terrible pronunciation. Originally released on the collectible French label Egg in 1977, then reissued on both LP and CD just over a decade ago. Now, some of you may know of Vian from his work in the Zappa-influenced jazz prog group Red Noise, who also only released the one LP and were rescued from the jaws of obscurity when they were included on the infamous Nurse with Wound list back in the day. Despite this solo work being weighted quite heavily towards rather mellow electronics and being entirely vocal-free, there are still traces of the anarchic Red Noise spirit here. Yeah, most notably in some of the more wayward, devil-may-care sound layering and soloing on offer, whilst on the closing piece, Tricentennial Drag, it's as if Vian can't hold back his absurdist urges any longer, the Frenchman unleashing an eccentric and chaotic collage of sampled national anthems, fanfares, motorbike noise and police sirens, which probably would have fitted quite snugly on his old group's LP. In addition, those in search of something a bit more energised may want to check out the piece that actually references said group, Tunnel 4 Red Noise, which is the album's most aggressive and avant-garde moment. As I say though, before that, quite a lot of this album is on the more laid-back side of things, burbling away on warm, inviting sequencer patterns as bits of synth and electric guitar squib and scratch away on top. A few of the pieces dreamily whisking us away to exotic foreign locations, whilst things like R&B Degenerate and Bad Blue are more like the types of tunes you'd stick on at your next space-age swingers party. In spite of some passing similarities with oft-mentioned German masters like Tangerine Dream and Klaus Schulze, overall, this one probably fits more readily with the quieter material of fellow Gallic sonic explorers like Helden and Lard Free, whilst the opening tune, Sphere, carries a bit of Zool flavour in. Then the more world music-leaning fusion jams preempt what the excellent Swiss group Brain Ticket did on LPs like Adventure and Voyage. So definitely a grower rather than something that immediately slaps you in the face with its brilliance. But yeah, if you're a devotee of this stuff, then Vian's lone effort is definitely something you need around for at least the occasional spin. Speaking of Schulze and Tangerine Dream, here we have 3 albums by You, also known as Eurovision, a German combo formed in 1978, just as the so-called Berlin School branch of electronic music was going stratospheric, thanks in no small part to the crossover appeal of those aforementioned acts. Initially comprising of synth wizards Udo Hanton and Albin Meskis, guitarist Ulrich Weber, and former drummer for the likes of Wallenstein and Schulze himself, Harold Grosskopf. You debuted in 1979 with Electric Day, first issued on the short-lived Kane label, and reissued by the ever-dependable Bureau B back in 2011. And yeah, right away we can hear that whilst they were coming out with some nice music, You were very much followers rather than leaders at this early stage in their career. Yeah, as the sequencers burble, the synths noodle, and the electric guitars float skyward, comparisons with the big hitters of the German scene become utterly unavoidable. Chuck in Grosskopf's trademark propulsive percussion work, and yeah, at times you'd swear that these were just a bunch of Klaus outtakes from his classic period. Stringman Weber is obviously enthralled to Manuel Gotching here, meaning more guitar-centric cuts like Maguba end up more in the Ashra influence camp, even bringing to mind the solo work of fellow space shredder Steve Hillage as well. But yeah, basically what I'm saying here is that as an album, Electric Day is pretty much 100% hero worship. Very entertaining and classy hero worship, but yeah, if it's originality you're after, then you'll have to look elsewhere. That said, I guess one area in which U differed from their forebears was in their tendency to mostly keep their tracks short. Yeah, as Schnitzler and TD grappled with ever more sprawling compositional structures. Speaking of the 8 tracks from the original LP issue of Electric Day, only one of these pieces passes the 10-minute mark, the aptly named slow burner Slow Go, whilst admittedly the closer, the exploratory 084, feels like it goes on a lot longer than its 8.5 minutes. But yeah, overall, this is a way more compact and user-friendly version of that occasionally overly epic and self-indulgent style. This handsome Digipack edition includes the same generous clutch of bonus pieces as on the previous CD issue from the 90s, beginning with the epic neon synthscape E-Night, and ending with the maddening looped chirping of the punningly titled Useless. Whilst it's unclear exactly when these extra tracks were recorded, the lack of guitar and acoustic drums suggests that they came about after Electric Day, more closely resembling the work they'd produce on their subsequent albums, but more on those in a second. Yeah, Useless aside, controversially, I actually prefer these bonus tracks to anything on the main album. There's just something about their cold, dystopian, nocturnal moodiness that appeals more to my sensibilities. But yeah, not a bad start on the whole. On to Time Code, first released in 1983 on the even more short-lived label Rock City Records, which was also responsible for putting out LPs by the likes of crazed heavy psych screamer Terry Brooks and the bluesy yacht rockers, the Wells Fargo Band. In sharp contrast to that stuff, though, what we have here are 11 detailed electronic pieces, 9 from the original issue, plus 2 bonus cuts. Again, these are mostly pretty short, with only 4 going beyond the 5-minute mark and none being longer than 10. By this point, you were officially a duo, with only Hanton and Meskis remaining from the days of their debut. Consequently, the more space-rocky elements from Electric Day are all but absent, with synths and sequencers fully to the fore, and the beats all being generated electronically. That said, Ulrich Weber does guest on the moody but brief Blue Water Dream, in which his heavily treated, Andy Summers-esque guitar chords fight to be heard above chirping synth chaos. The music here is oftentimes as chilly and blue as the evocative cover art would suggest, with pieces like the militaristic 2011-28 coated in icy reverb, whilst more commercially oriented cuts like Metallique feature much warmer sounding, sentimental central melodies. Altogether, this is way more composed sounding than the meandering, solo-heavy debut. Yeah, even the epic centerpiece here, Liveline, is pretty tightly focused, only really breaking into improvisational flights of pitch-bending fancy in its closing stages. Whilst the shadow of Mr. Schnitzler still looms large in places, overall, Time Code draws way more from the synth-poppy end of the electronic spectrum, bringing to mind the likes of contemporaneous Kraftwerk, Peter Baumann, and even Vangelis, without necessarily being as much of a hero-worshipping fest as the previous LP. So quite how much you enjoy this one obviously depends on the amount of synth pop cheese you can tolerate in your cosmic, progressive electronic stew. But yeah, personally speaking, I think Timecode straddles the two worlds pretty nicely for the most part, with only one or two tracks getting a bit cloying. By the way, any Mellotron fiends out there might want to get hold of this if you haven't done so already. It's not featured on every piece as far as I'm aware, though it's prominent on the opening title track, as well as being used more subtly on the brooding bonus cut Zone Black. For some reason, Yu's third long player, Wonders from the Genetic Factory, wasn't a part of Bureau B's reissue campaign, and the mid-90s CD of this one is hard to find for a good price, so I don't have that one yet. However, I do have the next one, Laserscape, from 1986. Now, by all accounts, as happened with some of their contemporaries, we could have expected for Yu to have gone in a full-blown commercial direction by this point, swapping out all their analog gear for tacky digital keyboards and blaring out predictable, lowest common denominator tunes aimed squarely at the masses. In the end, though, whilst it's certainly not perfect, Laserscape turned out a way more interesting proposition than its uninspiring release date might suggest. Yeah, opening with passing landscapes, a spooky, free-form dronescape, shot through with arcs of Mellotron menace and ripe with Cold War-era paranoia, the album kicks off properly with Can You Tell Me Where I Am?, which sounds a heck of a lot like the stuff labelled as synthwave nowadays. Yeah, if you've ever seen Drive or The Neon Demon by Nicholas Winding Refn, or pretty much any retro horror film from the past 12 years or so, then you'll no doubt have heard tracks trying their hardest to sound like this on the score. After this, we're plunged headfirst into the album's most exploratory and experimental piece, the 13-minute Changing Rooms, an immersive assemblage of atonal synth drift and heavily treated nature sounds, all topped off with icy blasts of gothic Mellotron. Yeah, did I mention that Laserscape is another must-buy for any self-respecting Mellotron freaks? This darkened New Age vibe is continued for a time by Travelling Hologram, which eventually settles into a staccato, proto-Deadcan dance orchestral motif, overlaid with startling, cut-up fragments of Spanish guitar from a guy named Jaime M. Zenneman, before concluding with bubbling, high-tech John Carpenterisms. Scanned Noises carries on with the Spanish picking from Zenneman, his improvised-sounding flourishes, skipping over a rather menacing and monotonous synth bass pulsing, as atmospheric pads ebb and flow around them. Then the two-part Curious Phenomena wraps things up, firstly with some more of that straight-ahead, sequencer-driven electro, which carries a curious, almost Middle Eastern vibe, whilst the second part is Laserscape's darkest cut, another free-flowing mood piece, pulled along by a pitch-black drone and with yet more of that freaked-out Mellotron, seemingly summoned via King Crimson or Don Bradshaw Leather's particular circle of musical hell. As with the other two CDs from the Bureau B reissue campaign, this one duplicates the bonus material from the previous 90s CD issue in the form of Laserscape Live, a 20-minute plus workout recorded prior to the album sessions at a summer 1985 event dubbed the Philips Laserscape. I should point out that this and other lasertastic multimedia extravaganzas like it were the idea of prolific artist Horst H. Baumann, for which you were especially commissioned to provide the music. The Laserscape album was then assembled using themes previously played live at the installations. whilst said album is surprisingly mostly pretty light on the fromage, with nasty digital embellishments and the like kept to a minimum. The live recording is decidedly whiffy, with Hanton or Mescus noodling away incessantly on a tacky, trumpet-like synth setting which soon gets tiresome. It's not a complete write-off, opening and closing in a much more interesting fashion, though in truth it mostly just sounds like one of Tangerine Dream's cornier extended jams from around the same time. Overall though, out of the three I own, for me, Laserscape is definitely U's most interesting and original release. And as I said, if you're into all that retro synthwave and horror soundtrack stuff that's all the rage at the moment, then this comes highly recommended for a taste of the real thing. We finished this roundup of vintage electronic excellence with a look at the main two studio albums by Kluster, this being Kluster with a K, the legendary experimental unit initially comprising of Konrad Schnitzler, Dieter Moebius and Hans-Joachim Roedelius. Formed at the very end of the 60s, as I'm sure many listening will be aware, the band's earliest performances took place at Schnitzler and Roedelius' club, the Zodiac Free Arts Lab. Their exploratory sets, comprising of freely improvised sounds made on standard rock and classical instruments, as well as assorted household appliances, which were then processed through primitive electronic effects. The trio wasted no time in laying down some of these adventurous sonics to tape, teaming up with producer extraordinaire Connie Plank and recording this album, Klopfzeichen, in the run-up to Christmas in 1969. Again, as many will know, bizarrely, Schnitzler somehow managed to wangle Kluster a sponsorship deal with the church, meaning both of the albums I'm discussing today were initially released by the German religious label Schwann. The one catch being that the band were under obligation to include a certain amount of religious spoken word content on each. So yeah, right away on part one, the first of two 20-minute plus epics here, we're confronted with snatches of speech by a rather severe-sounding lady named Christa Runge, who's presumably extolling the virtues of God and Jesus, whilst Kluster do their thing in the background. Starting off subtly, the trio feed a succession of doomy piano bongs and percussive thumps through an echo unit, whilst sinister washes of spacey noise hover intimidatingly overhead. The fellas actually doing a really good job of anticipating the creep-tastic score from Last House on Dead End Street. After a time, Runge ups the intensity of her delivery and Kluster follows suit, assaulting us with shocks of devilishly ugly, Miles-styled organ dissonance. After this, things wind down again, the piece seesawing between further sparse, metallic echoscapes and nightmarishly cacophonous climaxes until its conclusion, the spoken interjections lessening the further in we get, before disappearing altogether for the rest of the album. Yeah, cutting in right where part one left off. On part two, Kluster have free rein to let their music do the talking. And after another slow build, featuring some effective, proto-Taj Mahal Travellers-styled, wordless drone singing from one of the gents, alongside the expected echoed knocking sounds, eventually someone gets to work bowing the life out of an electric guitar, which groans and squeals in feedbacking agony, kicking the rest of the piece into life. The second half of this epic then sees Kluster occasionally drifting into a weird form of cranky, deconstructed rock jamming, in which weird, half-formed riffs from said guitar are overlaid with spectral organ work and peals of hippie freak-out flute. Either side of these, however, perhaps sensing that things have momentarily ended up too musical, The trio also managed to open a veritable Pandora's box of grumbling industrial chaos on our unsuspecting lug holes to redress the balance. Now, when these Kluster albums were first reissued on CD in the 90s, via labels like Hypnotic and Think Progressive, each featured an extended excerpt from a live performance that the post-Schnitzler Kluster with a C did alongside a percussionist named Joshi Farnbauer. Taking place at Vienna's Wiener Festwochen alternative event in 1980, a full recording of this live set was initially released on cassette only, via the now hyper-collectible label YHR tapes. So yeah, for a good while, these Kluster reissues were the only easy way to hear anything at all from this gig. Since then, thankfully, the whole set has been reissued on both vinyl and CD. I'll no doubt end up covering this at some point, so I won't say too much about the excerpt presented here, except that it fits decidedly well with what's gone before. On to Zwei-Osterei, recorded shortly after the first LP in 1970, but not released until 1971, again via the Schwann label. The version I have here is the Captain Tripp CD reissue from 2006, which comes in a handsome miniature replica of the original's embossed plastic sleeve. Now, in sharp contrast to the debut, here the band seem way less tentative and cautious, instead ploughing into the soundscapes with an aggressive confidence, at times barely letting up their assault for minutes on end. Yeah, the first piece, Electric Music und Text, is ushered in on a nagging, sawing, electrified cello drone, and it quickly builds up a head of steam, with the addition of heavy-handed organ squibs and tumbling percussion. Eventually, the cello breaks off into agonised, bovine wailing, while someone tortures the low end of the keyboard, conjuring flatulent chaos, seemingly straight from Satan's bowels, before we're treated to another dose of desolate, reverb-laden flute atonality. The cello then resumes its sawing duties, as echoed overtones and further flute wisps swarm overhead like restless spirits, eventually calming down, before once more building to a hellish fever pitch. Just to add to the intensity, all the while, the aforementioned text portion of the piece is being delivered by Manfred Paether, a gentleman so stern and serious that he makes Christa Runge sound like a kids' TV presenter in comparison. Eventually, this first piece dissolves back into the shadows, once again leaving the Kluster boys free to kick up a Jesus-free sonic storm all of their own. And yeah, they waste no time on this second track, sacking off the slow build method and just going for the jugular. Yeah, the trio really go out on a limb here, churning out minute after minute of thoroughly ugly, free-form chaos, with high screeches of feedback piercing through the dull, metallic thud of the percussion, as all manner of malfunctioning spaceship noise swirls around the edges. Eventually, the players converge for a time, breaking into some kind of strange, embryonic industrial pulsing, until everything is overwhelmed by massive and terrifying sheets of organ noise, which pour through the speakers like a vat of ultra-corrosive acid. With everything washed clean, the trio resume with the mutant industrial jamming, albeit in a way more fractured, fragmented way, until there's nowhere left to go, and again, things fade to silence. Okay, so the Captain Tripp reissues of Klopfzeichen and Zwei-Osterei come with their own unique bonus tracks, which are credited to both Kluster and Eruption. Now, I'm not even going to attempt to unpick the confusion surrounding the Eruption moniker, or indeed why, in this case, the pieces are also credited to Kluster. But yeah, basically, the one here, entitled Cold Winter 1971, features Konrad Schnitzler playing alongside Wolfgang Seidel and Klaus Freudigmann. And yeah, without going into great depth about it, again, it fits well with what's gone before, with assorted electronic zaps and squiggles, and dramatic waves of percussion floating over a reedy organ drone to begin, things eventually coalescing into rhythmic territory as the organ buzzing intensifies and waves of distortion swoop into the foreground, things then meandering about in a quiet, ambient fashion until the conclusion. Yeah, overall, this track never really gets too busy and noisy, unlike the material from the LP. So excellent stuff on the whole, which frequently goes even more out there than the contemporaneous first Tangerine Dream album, on which Schnitzler also played. That said, despite being thoroughly obsessed nowadays with this type of stuff, I must admit that when I first listened to Kluster, on a fittingly grey and chilly autumn afternoon back in the early 2000s, I ended up so bleaked out by their alien sonics that I remember having to take a nap midway through the CD. As I say, I've since grown to appreciate it, but even now I can kinda hear why I had that reaction all those years ago. And yeah, whilst many seem to find the spoken word additions to these LPs irksome, if not outright unlistenable, I actually don't mind them so much. Yeah, they're used quite sparingly in the grand scheme, and instead of simply being dumped lazily on top of the music to fulfill the contractual obligation, Planck and Kluster ensure that they end up a complementary part of the soundscapes, spacing them out for dramatic effect and oftentimes treating them electronically. Anyways, this has turned out to be another epic episode, so I'll leave it there for now. Rest assured, I'll be revisiting this topic before long with a look at another interesting bunch of releases from the electronic sphere. Until then, if you enjoyed this video and want more, please hit subscribe to keep abreast of all future developments, and please check out the archive for similar content. So all that's left to say is thanks for watching, and I'll catch you again soon on the Acid Trash Jamboree.